Hello, I'm honoured to be at the Warwick Words Festival. It's a great pleasure to be talking to you. I'm going to start by talking about how I came to write a book about George Eliot in the first place. I was reading some essays by her, and the introduction quoted a letter by William Hale White. The letter had been written when Eliot, whose real name was Marian Evans, had been dead 5 years, and the first biography of her had just been published. The biography was written by Johnny Cross, the younger man whom Eliot had so unexpectedly married at the last year of her life. As I had the honour of living in the same house with George Eliot for about 2 years, wrote Hale White, I may perhaps be allowed to correct an impression which Mr. Cross's book may produce on its readers. To put it briefly, I think he has made her too respectable. She was really one of the most unusual, sceptical characters I ever knew, and it was this side of her character which was to me the most attractive. She told me that it was worthwhile to undertake all the labour of learning French if it resulted in nothing more than reading one book, Rousseau's Confessions. I can see her now, with her hair over her shoulders, the easy chair half sideways to the fire, her feet over the arms and a proof in her hands in that dark room at the back of number 142. This small paragraph convinced me immediately that I had the wrong picture of Eliot in my head as stuffy and staid. Here she was, adoring Rousseau's Confessions, an extraordinary book in which Rousseau admits to experiencing sexual thrills as a child when he was beaten. She was a working journalist, number 142 being the famous house in the Strand where she edited the Westminster Review, progressive journal of the day. And those legs over the armchair, the whiff of unorthodox physical freedom, was intriguing, as was the sense that she was thrilled by intellectual pushing out, by ventures into the new, the strange yet the true. I instantly wanted to write a biography of her. But I read Gordon Hay's, and his was so good I thought I could have nothing to add. Still, I continued to read biographies of her, and then I began to notice something else. Each time I got to the end of her life, I had this jarred feeling. The story, I felt, had gone to a weird place. It didn't seem to fit at all with what had gone before. The episode concerned a younger man, a secret romance and a marriage, and an attempted suicide on the honeymoon by the man in question. The facts were wild. The groom jumping from a hotel balcony into the Venice Grand Canal over several gondolas to try to drown himself. So what had gone on in this romance, and why did he go mad? And why did it only take up a few pages of each biography? She was suddenly more mysterious to me. Until that point, the story of her life is a glorious pleasure to read. You identify, you love her for the way she meets life's challenges, for her courage, her genius, her rich take on life and people, her sympathy. You love her relationship with the ever-supportive Lewes. But with this final secret romance, you don't love her. You're just a little disappointed. And looking a bit closer, I began to wonder if she wasn't disappointed too, in herself that is, conflicted above all. I was now really curious, and it occurred to me to write about her, but in a different way, in a novel. I looked at her life again. It was a richly dramatic story. George Eliot was born Marian Evans in 1819, far from the big smoke of London, in Nuneaton in Warwickshire. Her father, who was manager of the Arbury estate, was not especially educated, but he encouraged Marianne, or Marian as she called herself later, and gave her tutors so she could learn German and Italian. Gradually she came to know the intelligentsia in Coventry, became atheist, and used her German to translate a significant text that interpreted Christianity as history and myth as opposed to gospel truth. From there she made her way to London to earn a living by her pen and work on the Westminster Review. She met everyone, from Herbert Spencer to Carlyle to Dickens. She was not beautiful, and she had a tendency to fall in love with men who didn't reciprocate. But in her early 30s, she met George Henry Lewes, the brilliant, witty, also ugly polymath, and her affection was returned. Yet there was a catch, as there must be in all good stories. It was a catch that typified Victorian double standards. Lewes was married but lived separately from his wife, who had for a long time had an affair with his best friend Thornton Hunt. In fact, his wife had begun having children by Hunt. But Lewes was so generous, and such a generous free thinker, that even though the arrangement now made him sad, he let those children keep his name so they wouldn't be stigmatised as bastards. But for this reason, he couldn't get a divorce. He'd officially condoned the adultery. Thus, Lewes and Marian couldn't marry. Affairs in Victorian life were acceptable so long as they were discreet, but Marian wanted to be open. She decided to call herself Marian Lewes and live with the still married Lewes as if she were his legal wife. And it's almost certainly still hard for our era to grasp the enormity of this step. She became notorious overnight. From this point, women would fear to visit her. Her family cut her off for the next 25 years. So Marian was infamous before she was even famous. Yet her courage was rewarded. The somewhat lonely, ostracised woman began writing in secret under the pseudonym George Eliot. Adam Bede came out and rapidly became famous. Like everyone marvelling at Cinderella at the ball, wondering who the mysterious stranger is, all England was wondering who George Eliot was, this mystery genius who had such understanding and moral vision. For a while her identity stayed hidden. When an impostor declared he was George Eliot and was believed, it was too much. Slowly she outed herself. And with her books, everything changed. Her books were adored, so much so that she was forgiven. In fact, she began to be adored. Everything was read the other way. What had seemed like brazen, outrageous behaviour with Lewes was now seen as courageous and honest, the avoidance of society's hypocrisy, and, too, evidence of an especially true love between her and Lewes. Her story is a fairy tale. The ugly duckling turns out to be a swan, Cinderella a princess, the overlooked child is loved and admired by all. It's every person's favourite story about him or herself, and a staple of fiction, from Anne of Green Gables to Stendhal's Le Rouge et le Noir. Lewes turned out to be the dream husband. Eliot had a strong, gloomy, self-doubting streak. And again he reassured her, he encouraged her to believe in herself. He was the husband every writer longs for. They were two driven intellectuals who had everything in common, and he was a blissfully vivacious and entertaining man too. When he died, Marian was devastated. They had been together for 24 years, and this, I suppose, is where the fairy tale was meant to end. Instead, it's a little like the moment in Cinderella when midnight strikes. The loving, grieving widow, spectacularly famous, who's become England's secular saint, the country's revered moral genius, falls speedily in love with Johnny Cross, 20 years younger. Suddenly, the saint appeared to have feet of clay, and this really did seem to me to be a good proposition for a novel. Two novels about George Eliot already existed, about that last year in her life, by Terence DeVere White and Denitia Smith. I looked at reviews of Smith's book, and her approach sounded what you might call relatable, making me step fearfully back. I didn't read it in the end, because I wanted very much to follow my own instincts about what was up with Eliot through all this, by close reading of her and much else, and I was afraid that if I read Smith's book, I might be pushed in a direction that was not my own. I did read, though, the Terence DeVere White, as I knew immediately that this was a different kind of story. I loved that novel and felt it highlighted, in witty if lurid colours, aspects of George Eliot's secret Achilles heel, her pride, for instance, and a certain solemnity, that had horribly comic potential if you wanted to go that way. But I didn't want to go that way, as certain kinds of comedy can be easily reductive, and I was much more moved by her struggle than amused. Nor did I want to just concentrate on the last year of her life. Now this was because I'd been struck by something else, the way her story seemed so little known. And this is in spite of all the splendid biographies that have been written about her. It had not, it seemed, entered the public imagination. People who are passionate fans of Middlemarch and Mill on the Floss seemed strangely unaware of her very eventful life. There she is, our own George Eliot, up there with Jane Austen in terms of stature, although so different, this writer of Tolstoy breadth and such grown-up psychological complexity. And yet people don't know about her life, in all its expressive drama. So I had bold hopes that my novel could remedy this, make her story sufficiently enjoyable and accessible, and livable in the way that only fiction can be, that it might perhaps become more known. For this and other reasons, I wanted to tell the whole fairy tale rise from notoriety to celebrity, and then in that context try to understand the late romance with Johnny Cross. I began the process of research. Eliot's life is richly documented, except for that mysterious 18 months at the end. But as I read through biographies and others more anecdotal accounts of hers, and the letters, I was tantalised. Her own writings in letters and diaries were so expressive of her, so unique and interesting, that not to quote them directly at certain points seemed like growing a cherry tree and not eating the cherries, or finding treasure and throwing away the jewels. I thought about it. By writing a novel, I would be making up conversations, thoughts, feelings. So I would have to use my imagination. But I also wanted my book to be an inquiry into her, to be an interpretation and recreation of her based on the closest possible reading of details of her life, of her letters, of everything I could find, so that even when the form of the novel required me to make up, say, meetings, rather than dramatise meetings I knew had actually happened, even then all such inventions would need completely to work with biographical fact. In the end, with a nod to autofiction, which interests me very much, with its combination of real and invention, I decided to write a hybrid novel. I would include real quotations from her letters and diaries. They are wonderful bits of writing in their own right, and they open a direct window onto her. My book would yield the satisfaction of fiction, I hoped, and yet the reader could, I hoped, have the thrill of knowing that here was her real voice too. There was a relationship to reality, as it were, within the fiction. So how to understand her from the inside, so to speak? I researched her, read biographies, accounts of contemporaries, and perhaps most of all those letters. There are 9 large volumes of them. Elements in these letters began to strike me. She kept writing to friends the morning after a social occasion, apologising for the night or day before. Dearest B, this is Barbara Bodichon, I feared after you were gone that I had seemed to urge your coming in a selfish sort of way. There are lots of letters like this. She minds how she is seen, and this is relevant to her larger philosophy of life. She didn't really trust people's ability to see others accurately, with tolerance and understanding in the round. And she sees it as her own writerly mission to correct this. Here she is introducing the reader to Lydgate in Middlemarch. At present, I have to make the new settler Lydgate better known, for surely all must admit that a man may be puffed and belauded, envied, ridiculed, counted upon as a tool and fallen in love with, or at least selected as a future husband, and yet remain virtually unknown, known merely as a cluster of signs for his neighbours' false suppositions. She's being funny, but she's being serious too. You can think you know someone from what you see online or read in the newspapers, but what you know has little to do with the autonomous reality of that person. And I think Eliot's fictional purpose, to move people through experience and feeling into seeing other people in their full complexity, was always intended as an antidote to this difficulty of seeing, part of the problematic condition of being human. She was always conscious of how she would be seen by others, the instant pictures and stories that would form. All the more mysterious, then, that this was both her great fictional purpose and theme, think of Maggie Tulliver in Mill on the Floss, but that it also became, irony of ironies, her own story. This is where I saw the possibility of a meaningful novel about her. In this romance with Johnny Cross, she found herself trapped in a situation, like one of her heroines, where she felt she would be seen without mercy or understanding. My novel's shape seemed roughly to be her struggle to write, while aware of society's condemnation of her metamorphic rise to stardom, followed by her struggle when she found herself in love with Johnny Cross. The shape pivots around the 2 times she shocked the world. First, by living unwed with a married man, Lewes. Second, by marrying the younger Cross in a church, 25 years later. At 2 key moments in her life, she had the power of mind to hold on to her convictions in the face of public displeasure. And this is one of the things that I find continually wonderful about her. But if her marriage with Cross was to be the book's climax, I had to have a clear grasp of their relationship. Yet there are few Cross letters. There is little information about him. Perhaps because of this paucity, most biographers sum up the entire romance in a few pages. The biographical tone is interesting, though. Often the romance is recounted with a faintly loyal, championing air, suggesting implicitly that her behaviour required defence. I wondered if these accounts were invisibly arguing with a more hidden but highly stereotypical picture to do with older women and sex, as in opera buffa or farce, where the greedy, sexually voracious, ugly old hag pushes the handsome younger man to have sex with her. 2 years ago, I attended the Literary Review's Bad Sex Party and inadvertently found myself conducting a vox pop of contemporary attitudes towards Eliot, as I explained I was writing about her. "Oh, I don't like her," said an opera critic with an air of displeasure. "Too greedy." A feminist literary critic opined the same. "Too much appetite," she said. A third, similarly. This short-lived marriage at the end of Eliot's life had, it seemed, had an impact for posterity, let alone Eliot's own contemporaries. I wanted to get behind such stock pictures and understand this relationship as best I could. I tried various avenues of research, looked for letters, spoke to descendants, spoke to biographers who had different accounts of her. The evidence still remained scant. I gave up the search for new evidence and looked at what was there. We know a few things for certain. Marian and Johnny Cross were married in May 1880, and she died before the year was out. Johnny lived till 1924 for 44 more years, with no woman in sight. He might have been gay. He might have been involved to a disturbed degree with his mother. We know he was close to his mother. We also know he had had at least one previous episode of mental disturbance. I looked again at the bare biographical facts. Johnny Cross met the Leweses in 1869 with his mother, Anna Cross, just when Eliot was mulling Middlemarch. The 2 families quickly became great friends. I began to find the emerging shadowy picture of Cross's role in their life interesting. Lewis's diary always listed the cast of visitors that came to visit on Sundays at their famous weekly salon, and soon the name J. Cross starts to recur with unfailing regularity. And this man was helpful. By 1872, Johnny was not just a constant guest at the salons. He'd become their financial manager, successfully dealing with their investments. He was also looking for a country house for them. Whenever there was a practical need, such as buying a coach, Johnny was on hand. Eliot and Lewes began calling him nephew. By being so trustworthily useful and a close family friend as well, he began to occupy a special favoured position with the couple. In 1876, when Johnny finally found a country house for them, it's somehow no surprise to learn that the house he found in Whitley is only 15 miles away from Johnny's own residence, the Cross establishment in Weybridge. When they move in, Johnny brings a tennis set as a gift. Lewes's letters to Johnny are affectionate, but there's a hint of untoward freedom in them too, as of a master addressing a servant who has no need to dress up his demands, indicating that Johnny's helpfulness, his friendly willingness, was as it were unconditional. I had a sense that he was so obliging he would never reflect back anything problematic to them. Significantly, in a moment of family tragedy, when Lewes's neglected second son Bertie dies in Africa, it's Johnny to whom Marian writes an unusually self-absolving letter. Johnny was the safe port of call. I began to read shadowy intention into Johnny's assiduousness, a quiet determination to enter the stellar celebrity lives of the Leweses, one of those people who would not so much make his own life as find a place in the pocket of others. I wondered, too, if there had been a certain latent quality in his recurring presence, in this specialness. Eliot's letters to him while Lewes is alive are robustly, humorously aunt to his nephew, but they can be playful to the point of flirtatious. This latent quality was for me curiously confirmed by Edith Simcox. Now, Edith Simcox was a highly educated younger writer and social activist who was madly in love with Eliot and who kept a diary of her passionate, obsessive feelings. A powerful streak of jealousy runs through the diary. Yet she identifies her rival not as Marian's husband, Lewes, but Johnny, the quasi-son, the nephew, the tall, handsome, intimate family friend. Lewes died at the end of November 1878. Sympathy poured out to the gloriously famous widow. "The whole of Europe mourns with you," wrote Turgenev. She didn't go to the funeral. For a week she didn't leave the room in which Lewes had died. Her bouts of hysterical crying were heard by the servants. It was a bitterly cold winter. The pipes were frozen. In the spring she slowly engaged with life again, seeing no one except servants and her stepson, Charles Lewes. The pivotal moment comes in April, when, panicked by requests for money, she turns to Johnny Cross, nephew, for help. Cross, as we know, wrote her official life, sewing together her letters with bits of linking text. "From that moment," he says demurely, "we saw each other constantly." The mysterious latent quality identified by Edith Simcox has ceased to be latent. They psychologically fit each other. What they have in common is bereavement. Marian's partner Lewes and Johnny's mother died within 9 days of each other. The grieving pair agree to read Dante together. Soon the romance begins. All drama is based on conflict, and the more I understood this part of her life, the more I came to feel it could justly feature as the climactic part of my novel, as at no other point in her life, I believe, was she so conflicted as when she found herself in love with Cross. She kept her growing involvement absolutely secret. She now had the most extreme celebrity, and she had no illusions at all about how this marriage would be greeted by the world. She herself could, I believe, not always understand it. She could clearly see that this romance was in a certain sense unaccountable and even a little dismaying, so quick after the long, rich love she'd shared with Lewes, and for which she'd undergone trial by fire. Yet there it was. But to marry Cross meant being horribly adjusted in people's minds, giving up that sweet spot. And I would like to refer back now to those anxious letters correcting the bad impression she fears she's made the day before. But here the anxiety is macro. She was fairly split right down the middle. An almost uncanny mirroring also seems to be going on between her life and her art. She's stuck like Maggie Tulliver. In Mill and the Floss at the end, I think Eliot had written herself into a corner. Unlike many others, I'm convinced by the coupling of Maggie and Stephen Guest. Guest is the fiancé of Maggie's pretty, but also, a masterstroke of Eliot's here, genuinely sweet and generous-tempered cousin Lucy. The romance is a betrayal of Lucy on every level, but where can Eliot take Maggie? For all her fabulous psychological realism, Eliot couldn't bear for Maggie to lose that sense of being morally loved by the reader, just as she, Eliot, couldn't bear not to be morally loved. I believe she felt, accurately, the romance with Cross to be anti-romantic in the eyes of others. The solution with Maggie was to kill her off, but what about herself? If she was to marry Cross, she would need just the kind of understanding her own novels provided, and she did not trust even her closest, most intimate and loving women friends not to judge her in this instance, as her letters attest. In her book, The Real Life of Marian Evans, the brilliant literary scholar Rosemary Bodenheimer maintains that Marian's experience of being ostracised with Lewes gave her great recurring story, this kind of story, where there is a terrible choice to be made and no easy or clear way forward. I felt the roots of this story, of someone struggling to find the right shape for others' eyes, went deeper, that for her the problem of uninformed, unimaginative judgment was more fundamental. Only through the proxy imaginative living that fiction permits can this gap that exists between people be overcome. It's the gap that I think Eliot never forgot, that each consciousness is in fact separate. In spite of biographers, in spite of novelists, there is no actual means of entering another's mind and feelings. Not really. There are multiple accounts of Eliot's personally charismatic power, of her fascinatingly tender, ugly beauty. She captivated people, enthralled them with her charm. Edith Simcox was captive to her charms, obsessed, passionate, prone to visiting, and then, when Eliot bade her leave because Johnny was there, returned through Kensington Gardens and stopped to weep under a tree. Maria Congreve also loved Eliot, and was in love with her. As Maria Congreve later confided into Simcox, she too, in Simcox's words, loved Simcox's darling lover-wise. I saw Johnny as a natural supplicant, and the account that emerges of the marriage is very much an account where the power is Eliot's. In the story of her life, the crazed leap from a balcony by Johnny Cross into the Venetian Grand Canal from 2 stories high comes like a bolt from the blue. But in fact, looking at the letters, one can see fragments of a different evolution. The letters begin by striking a note of really fresh, liberated happiness on the honeymoon. Gradually, however, a certain strain begins to show in Johnny's hand. Eliot was the commanding spirit behind their itinerary on the honeymoon, large amounts of sightseeing and churches, often staying at hotels she'd stayed at with Lewes, evenings that echoed the evenings with Lewes, involving quantities of reading. She was instructor, guide, she had the power. But the great event, Cross writes from the honeymoon to Eliot acolyte Elmer Stewart, that has happened in my life seems to have taken away from me all power of doing or thinking of anything except how marvellously blessed is my lot, to be united for life with her who has for so long been my ideal. It is almost too great happiness to have got the best. This reads like a perfectly normal letter, but looking at it again, it doesn't quite. Language, with its multifaceted capability, is doing 2 things at once. On the one hand, Johnny's words are performing socially, with the lover's extravagant rhetoric. On the other hand, he is stating, with peculiar literalness, that he is losing his agency. He has lost all power of doing, he says. He has lost all power of thinking. He is losing his affect. Is this a clue to the nature of his madness? He can only think how marvellously blessed is his lot. More specifically, quote, "It is almost too great happiness to have got the best," he writes. The words can be parsed for their Freudian meaning as a description of Oedipal overreaching. In terms of that reading, he has married his mother and possibly had sex with her. The reading is to me plausible. He did take leave of his senses. He did want and try to die. I came to see Eliot's power as her Achilles' heel. She had risen gloriously into it, but the eminence had its hubristic danger. Psychologically, emotionally, Johnny Cross was a rabbit caught in her more powerful headlights, willing to be anything for her, just as he had been willing to do anything for her and Lewes. Well, thank you very much. Bye-bye.